Descended from a long line of Jedi, including an uncle and a niece, Plo Koon was an eminent Jedi Master during the waning days of the Republic. Koon's grim and imposing appearance belied a kind and compassionate nature, which garnered him the respect of not only his fellow Jedi, but also the servicemen he commanded and inspired throughout his long career. Considered to be polite and humble almost to a fault, Plo Koon was the final Padawan of a powerful Jedi Master, the aged Wookiee, Tuvok, with whom he remained close, long after having passed his Jedi trials. Plo Koon's circle of friends extended to include his peers, the competitive and charismatic Micah Giet, and the stoic maverick Qui-Gon Jinn, the latter of whom Plo Koon once wished to abdicate his prospective seat on the Jedi High Council to. Due to his instrumental involvement in the Stark Hyperspace War, Plo Koon was nominated to replace Tuvok on the Jedi High Council following the Wookiee's death, a position he accepted in honor of his fallen master's final wishes. As a Jedi Master, he would complete the training of his late friend Micah Giet's former pupil, Boltar Swan. He also discovered the young Togruta, Ahsoka Tano, who went on to become one of the most heroic and talented Jedi of her generation. Following the outbreak of the Clone Wars and Geonosis, Master Koon took up his role as a Jedi General, serving as one of the most highly esteemed throughout the conflict. Plo Koon served as one of the foremost military strategists and tacticians amongst the Jedi Order, and engaged in such conflicts as the Battle of Brental IV, Korm, and many more. Eventually, Plo Koon was betrayed by his squadron of clone troops and shot down over Cato Neimoidia in accordance with the execution of Order 66. The reasons for his execution, along with those of many other victims of the Purge, would be falsified in official Imperial reports, but Plo Koon's surviving Jedi comrades and political allies would know the truth of his sacrifice. Born over a century before the Battle of Yavin, Anya Kurra was an enigmatic Jedi Master who remained something of a mystery even to her colleagues. Tasked during her early years with seeking out children strong in the Force, Anya Kurra journeyed far and wide as a member of the Acquisition Division for the Jedi Order. One of Kurra's earliest discoveries was that of the 4-year-old Ki-Adi-Mundi on Syria. Anya Kurra was a stern Jedi Master and maintained an almost startling adherence to the Jedi Code. Uncomfortable with forming close attachments whether to people or property, she claimed to have relinquished all of her possessions, including her own name, allowing others to simply call her the Dark Woman. Noted for her harsh training methods, which some considered to be disturbing and perhaps even abusive, Kurra was often appointed what she termed difficult students by the decision of the Jedi Council, the most infamous of whom was the failed Padawan turned bounty hunter, Aurra Sing. Although she spent many years away from the temple, Anya Kurra would later serve in the Clone Wars, beginning with the very first Battle of Geonosis. During this period, Aurra Sing would attempt to avenge herself upon her former mentor by setting a deadly trap on Deveron. However, Sing was eventually defeated and captured by the young Jedi Master, Aayla Secura. Following the war's end, Anya Kurra went into a self-imposed exile, like most of the survivors of the Jedi Purge. Located by the Emperor's hand, Mara Jade, Anya Kurra was confronted by the Sith Lord, Darth Vader, on the planet Kofragan V, nearly 2 decades after the formation of the Empire. After a brief philosophical debate, a duel of words rather than swords, regarding evolution and extinction, informed in many ways by their respective perceptions of and alignments within the Force, Vader attacked and Kurra defended. After a fierce battle, Anya Kurra was finally defeated. But as the Sith Lord brought his blade down upon his fallen enemy, the Jedi Master became one with the Force. Transcending the physical plane and surviving death, Anya Kurra returned as a Force spirit. the Jedi Master asserted her belief that there was still good inside Anakin Skywalker, and that he had the strength to free himself of the dark side's sway. Only a few short years later, aboard the second Death Star, Anya Kuro would be proven correct. Hey guys, Matt here. Welcome to the next installment of the Versus series here on Grey Jedi 91. So before I go any further, I wanted to take a moment and explain the timing of this project, as it clashes with certain promises I've made in the past. I wrote the script for this project more than 2 years ago, maybe even closer to 3 at this point, and I'm just now getting around to completing it. So yeah, when I say I'm going to do something, I do it, but no guarantees on doing it quickly. Additionally, I know I promised to have Sharad Het's Versus video out by now. I'm sorry to postpone it just a little further, but I feel the need to, guys. I had recorded narration for that with my older and cheaper microphone, which doesn't provide me the same level of audio quality as my new one. Considering how long I've been working on Sharad Het's Versus video, I want that final product to be a truly satisfying one, not just for you all, but for me as well. Now that I finally have some decent recording equipment that I'm actually happy with, I decided to hold off on completing Sharad Het's Versus video until I have a chance to redo the audio for it. Since I had already completed recording my voice for this project using my new equipment, I decided to crack on with Plo Koon vs Anya Kuro instead. At the time that I wrote the script for this project, I had been wanting to feature Plo Koon again for quite some time, but I had trouble deciding on who to pit him against. At around that time, I revisited Jen Sarai's old matchup, Plo Koon vs Darth Vader. It occurred to me while watching the video that perhaps another Jedi who actually had tested their mettle against Vader might make for a fun matchup. And so 2 to 3 years later, here we are. Without further ado, I present for you Jedi Master Plo Koon versus the Dark Woman, Anya Kuro. A native of his species' ancestral homeworld, Doran, Plo Koon was a powerfully built Keldor male who managed to reach old age despite the dangers he encountered throughout a long and adventurous career. Keldor physiology afforded them greater amounts of protection with which to survive the severe weather of their homeworld. Plo Koon has even shown himself to be capable of briefly surviving the vacuum of space. 4 sensitive members of the Keldor species used a form of telepathy in order to communicate amongst themselves. The growths located at the base of their skulls were suspected by researchers to be a subregion of the Keldor brain. As is to be expected, Plo Koon's extrasensory organs boosted his own telepathic powers, which will be detailed later. The Power of the Jedi sourcebook notes that Plo Koon and Qui-Gon Jinn became Jedi Masters together, as the two were great friends during their time as knights. This would indicate that Plo Koon was at the very least the same approximate age as Qui-Gon Jinn. According to the Ultimate Alien Anthology, Keldor and humans aged at a comparable rate. This means that by the time of the Clone Wars, at around 70 standard years of age, Plo Koon had crossed the threshold into venerability. As a race, Keldor are also noted for possessing quicker reflexes, though weaker constitutions than their human counterparts. However, I believe Plo Koon to have transcended this particular limitation with regard to physical resiliency. He has survived being buried beneath a telekinetically triggered avalanche, and has weathered beatings from Savage Opress, and even endured a kick to a broken arm from Visage Ventress without faltering. However, this respectable level of toughness aside, there was one drawback to his species' physiology which even he could not fully overcome. Like all members of his race, Plo Koon requires the use of a breath mask in order to survive in oxygen-rich atmospheres, and without his goggles he would be effectively blind when operating away from his homeworld or his private chamber within the Jedi Temple. Although it's true that this equipment has only ever been targeted by his opponents rarely, with only one observable occurrence on record, it is still an obvious point of vulnerability. Overall, Plo Koon was a seasoned warrior, possessed of a remarkable degree of health and fitness, as well as an extremely high level of dexterity for a being of his years. Having said that, as formidable as he is, his anti-oxygen equipment does present a tempting target to his opposition, and this is a weakness that he has allowed to be exploited, however rarely. Anya Kuro was a human female whose exact age remains uncertain. However, it is known that Ki-Adi-Mundi was born 92 years before the Battle of Yavin. It is also known that Ki-Adi-Mundi was discovered at the age of 4 and brought to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant by Anya Kuro herself. By the time of her duel with Darth Vader, even a conservative estimate would place Anya Kuro at over 110 years old. The sustaining power of the light side of the Force is known to increase one's viability well into old age, but the level of fitness retained by a woman of Anya Kuro's age is truly exceptional, even by Jedi standards. Anya Kuro has sustained blade locks against the likes of Darth Vader and Ashrad Het. She has endured a blaster bolt to the shoulder from friendly fire, a direct punch to the face from one of Vader's cybernetic fists, and even survived an explosion which brought a caved ceiling down upon her, each of these feats having occurred well after she reached old age. While she was, without a shadow of a doubt, a woman who had lived far beyond her physical prime, Anya Kuro's feats of strength, speed, and agility, even in her diminished state, are truly commendable. As an elderly human female, Anya Kuro possessed very few inborn advantages that would have given her any sort of edge over the vast majority of alien species within the Star Wars setting. However, this is a somewhat unusual case. As a race, humans are specifically noted for their resiliency and adaptability, traits which allowed them to become the most populous and widespread race throughout the galaxy, and this made them strong in the areas where Keldor were weak. However, as should be obvious, as a Jedi Master, Plo Koon offers much better competition than the typical Keldor would. Like Kuro, Koon has proven to be extremely tough and was noted for his physical strength, a factor which provides him an edge over Kuro. On the other hand, Anya Kuro was obviously the more agile and acrobatic of the two, providing her an edge over the aged Keldor. When we consider how both Jedi have compensated for their shortcomings against their various opponents, I think it's fair to say that these two factors are largely cancelled out. Plo Koon has successfully engaged Asajj Ventress in combat, and the Dark Jedi would have, on some level, outclassed Anya Kuro as an acrobat. Likewise, Anya Kuro has sustained blade locks with Darth Vader, who would have outclassed Plo Koon in the realm of physical strength. Despite how evenly matched these two clearly would be when fighting fresh and in peak condition, Anya Kuro's extreme old age limits the duration for which she can continue to fight against such high-caliber opponents. Like Darth Vader, I do believe that Plo Koon would eventually be able to wear Anya Kuro down, and she would need to call upon the Force in order to meet his attacks head-on. However, given how well she was able to contend with Darth Vader, I believe her to be capable of holding out against Plo Koon for an extensive period of time before fatigue truly starts to set in. While I would normally consider Plo Koon's advantage here to be rather dubious, as he himself is quite old, he was still 3 to 4 decades younger than Anya Kuro, and utilized a fighting form better suited to maintaining combative longevity. However, we'll speak more on that later. At the end of the day, Plo Koon is awarded a very slight physical edge, though the potential weakness imposed by his inability to breathe without his mask cannot be ignored. Counted among the most heroic Jedi of his day, Plo Koon was considered to be an elite swordsman within the Order until his death. His renown was such that even though the two never engaged in combat, the Sith apprentice, Darth Maul, would have considered the chance to duel the likes of Plo Koon to be a true test of his abilities. Although Plo Koon never faced the Sith assassin himself, he would eventually face off against Darth Maul's brother, Savage Opress. In the end, the Jedi was only brought to his knees when his breath mask was forcibly removed from his face. Prior to this point, Plo Koon had indeed managed to land a glancing strike against his opponent, angering the Dark Warrior. While I consider it slightly misleading to assert that Plo Koon was in control of this duel, as the Zabrak's incredible physical might enabled him to retaliate against Plo Koon with unarmed strikes, I still think it's noteworthy that the Jedi's ability to force his typically straightforward opponent to change the rules of the contest is indicative of his considerably greater sophistication as a swordsman. Savage Opress could not outright overpower him on that level, and so he had to resort to other means. On an even more impressive level, Plo Koon managed to best the infamous Jedi killer Asajj Ventress in a lightsaber duel on Korm, a feat made all the more noteworthy due to the fact that the Jedi Master was suffering from a broken arm for the majority of their engagement. He was also able to adapt to the diverse array of fighting styles she employed. He matched her strength-oriented saber-staff onslaught with obvious ease. In addition, after giving relatively little ground, he also met her dual-blade Jarkai approach, almost literally with one hand tied behind his back, though with a notable degree of difficulty, to be sure. Plo Koon warded off the Dark Jedi's assault and managed to rid her of one of her twin blades before countering and parrying her attack with his own staunch one-armed defense, all the while multitasking. Even Asajj Ventress herself, in a rare moment of compliment, admitted that the old Jedi had fought valiantly that day. Plo Koon was a master of the fifth form of lightsaber combat. Form 5 had two variants, Shien and Gemso. Plo Koon mastered both. The Shien variant was designed in order to address threats from blaster-wielding assailants by redirecting blaster fire. Unlike the almost purely defensive Surisu, Shien stressed the purposeful redirection of bolts back to the shooter, turning an ostensible defensive maneuver into a form of counterattack. Gemso operated along similar lines, though it was engineered to address lightsaber dueling specifically. This variant of the fifth form placed a heavy focus on deflecting or redirecting an opponent's lightsaber blows before countering with an additional powerful offensive, hence the style's moniker, the Perseverance form. In my opinion, true masters of Form 5 sacrificed elaborate and acrobatic defensive maneuvers in order to retain maximum offensive viability. While not stated outright anywhere in the lore, this, in my view, is what allowed Plo Koon to thrive in chaotic environments. He can remain the calm eye of the storm while remaining on the offensive, something traditional masters of Form 3, for example, would find most difficult. As a final boon, this also made his personal technique far more sustainable than the aggressive and evasive, though highly exhaustive, fourth form, Ataru. While he may not typically employ such elaborate tactics in battle, he can defend against those opponents who do use them. Plo Koon was also a highly capable unarmed fighter as well, as he demonstrated throughout his career. My friend Ready4 has speculated in his own videos concerning the character that Plo Koon was a master or else a high-level practitioner of Teräs Käsi, a fighting form initially designed and mastered by normal beings, enabling them to combat Force sensitives directly. This theory is based largely on the good-spirited rivalry and friendly competition he enjoyed with Micah Giet, and the fact that Koon guided Giet's former Padawan Boltar Swan to knighthood following Giet's death. Boltar Swan was well known for her dual specialization in hand-to-hand combat, which blended Teräs Käsi maneuvers with the Verdenian sliding hands techniques. She developed this skill set during her time under Master Micah Giet and the acclaimed lightsaber instructor and Teräs Käsi master Anun Bandara. While Ready's speculation that Koon mastered Teräs Käsi on this basis is unconfirmed by any source, it is stated that Plo Koon was the only one out of Boltar Swan's 3 primary mentors to have taught her how to blend these skills into her overall lightsaber technique. I have made it no secret that I often disagree with my friends on various points of loose speculation. However, this is not one of those times. Ready's belief that it would be impossible for a Jedi of this caliber to have failed to pick up a solid understanding of Terraskasi, given Koon's ability to instruct Swan on how to elevate the practice, not to mention the sheer power of the Master-Padawan bond, is a belief I share myself. However, at the end of the day, I find all of this to be far more interesting from the perspective of fleshing out Plo Koon's overall character, as it speaks well of his merits as an instructor. In practice, it's hard to say with certainty how much of an advantage his foundation in Terraskasi would really give him, given his track record. It is regrettably true that he experienced very little success in this regard during his observed duels with high-profile Force-sensitive opponents. Though, in all fairness to him, he was sporting a broken arm during his fight with Asajj Ventress, and he was also facing a magically augmented juggernaut when he fought Savage Opress. The use of such tactics would have been of no use to him during either conflict, despite the depth of his skill in that field. However, it is some consolation that, as commendable as his unarmed combat skills were, his ability to incorporate telekinetic force strikes into his lightsaber sequences was even more noteworthy. Plo Koon operates best while working in concert with others on a chaotic battleground, freely applying his tactical mind and willingness to persevere through the idea that the best defense is a good offense. While it is traditionally the sixth form of lightsaber combat, Naman, which is the jack-of-all-trades fighting style, incorporating elements of all the previous forms and emphasizing the usage of force powers in combat, Plo Koon's dual specialization in both variants of Form 5, coupled with his raw strength in the Force, affords him a very similar functionality. As he does with his Force powers, he uses his skills with martial arts in moderation, and while he may not be the absolute master of any given style, the end result is that when we view his overall technique as a whole, we can see that it has been forged into something greater than the sum of its parts. Clearly, Plo Koon's reputation as a great warrior is very well deserved. Although she was an obscure master who spent much of her life living on the galaxy's fringe, far from civilization, Anya Kuro remained a respected and valued instructor at the Jedi Temple for many years. During her time stationed at the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, her students knew that they could expect at least one lightsaber duel with her per week. It was also said that her students tended to be the most battered at the temple, though also the most skilled and devoted of lightsaber combatants, the notable Jedi killer, Aurra Sing, providing a testament to the high standard upheld by her teacher. Like Dooku had been, even during his time as a Jedi, Anya Kuro was a stern mentor and was not above relying on fear, surprise, or intimidation to truly test her students' levels of resolve. Words were weapons, every bit as potent as the blade of her lightsaber, and she used them to test her students' strength of will and dedication to the Jedi Code, even when engaged in the heat of combat. A tactic very similar to that of the Sith practice of Dun Mok, a form of psychological warfare. While this gave her some commonality with the Dark Lords of the Sith, ironically enough, I do believe that this is what made her such a capable teacher. Darth Plagueis noted that the Sith training techniques tended to produce more capable individuals than the Jedi because Sith apprentices were truly forced to sink or swim. Jedi Padawans, in comparison, could essentially afford to coast if paired with a master too inhibited by compassion to really push their students to their limits. This was something Anya Kuro never shied away from doing. In fact, her methods were so grueling and challenging that various members of the Jedi Council had even considered the possibility that Kuro had accidentally gone too far and killed Aurra Sing during a training session. While this rumor was completely untrue and put to rest following Aurra Sing's return to the galactic stage, the fact that this theory was entertained by multiple members of the Jedi leadership in the first place says a lot about the Dark Woman's foreboding reputation and unforgiving nature. Unsurprisingly, for someone with this resume, Anya Kuro regularly practiced with the chosen weapon of the Jedi Order, placing a strong emphasis on honing her skills with the lightsaber. And despite her mastery of many esoteric Force abilities, she is actually listed in her role-playing guide entries as a Jedi Guardian, rather than as a consular, as one might expect. Due to her frequent uses of acrobatics, whether due to reliance or preference, Anya Kuro is commonly thought to be a master of Ataru, the fourth and, in my view, most physically demanding of all lightsaber forms. Ataru emphasized using the entire body as a weapon, incorporating punches, kicks, and physical strikes into one seemingly wild, though disciplined blade work. The form was best suited to Jedi who were proficient in the use of the Force to bolster their physical attributes to a high degree. On the whole, Ataru was an exhaustive practice, and because of this, it was best employed in swift, concentrated bursts. Anya Kuro's skill with Ataru was such that she was able to overcome the youthful Ashrad Het, though it would be many years before the young man grew into the Dark Lord of the Sith known as Darth Krayt. Het was no mere neophyte Padawan at the time. Kuro defeated him in combat after he'd spent years training under his own father, the famed Jedi Knight, Sharad Het, a Padawan of Eth Koths, and a duelist whose skills were regarded highly by Master Yoda himself. Incidentally, it bears mentioning that Anya Kuro's erstwhile student, Aurra Sing, was also the famed Jedi's murderer. Her ability to defend against Ashrad Het's formidable application of Jar-Kai dual-blade tactics reflects her many years of experience and the broad range of fighting styles she's prepared herself to fight against. Most famously of all, though, Anya Kuro also met Darth Vader in battle, and though she would meet her apparent demise on that day, she gave him a much better fight than most. She was able to take advantage of her superior flexibility to dodge and counter Darth Vader's vicious attacks. More impressively, she was not entirely reliant on trickery, as some have alleged. She did make an intelligent use of her surroundings, but she was also fair competition for him purely as a lightsaber duelist, withstanding the full might of his assault and responding in kind. Although he was the stronger, both physically and in the Force, he was not able to easily subdue her, and at one point she even managed to legitimately disarm him, ridding the Sith Lord of his lightsaber, an extremely rare occurrence indeed. Overall, Anya Kuro was a deceptively talented and extremely dangerous lightsaber duelist. I think it's safe to say that anybody who could give Darth Vader such a challenge would effectively be fair competition for almost any fighter. While not typically counted by her peers as one of the great swordsmen produced by the Jedi Order, Anya Kuro was a bit of a dark horse, all things considered. Even in the absence of compelling accolades from her peers, her feats speak for themselves. She may not look like much, but underestimating the Dark Woman's skill with the lightsaber would undoubtedly be a very costly mistake indeed. Judging from in-universe accounts, Plo Koon seems to be the more famous and celebrated swordsman between the two. On the other hand, Anya Kuro's lesser renown may have simply been because of her obscurity, as even few among the Jedi High Council were directly familiar with her or her methods. You've got one who managed to misdirect, manipulate, and disarm Asajj Ventress while injured, and another who managed to ward off, disarm, and even nearly kill Darth Vader. While she did need to draw on her combined skill set and relied rather heavily on her Force abilities to accomplish some of this, it's notable that Vader didn't outright penetrate her lightsaber defenses directly. Instead, he physically overpowered her and literally threw her into a tight corner, making defense difficult. She lost primarily because she succumbed to fatigue. His greater vitality and physical might gave him the greatest advantage here, not his dueling skill. And while Plo Koon didn't truly defeat Asajj Ventress in combat when they fought, credit where credit is due. he certainly gained greater control of the situation than she did, and he not only survived the altercation, but actually led his forces to victory and won the day. Again underscoring the fact that he was injured on that occasion, I think he was one of the relatively few Jedi of his day who would have been at least capable of defeating Ventress and other opponents of her caliber in open combat and on fair terms, the various defensive lapses he suffered along the way notwithstanding. And while Anya Kuro did in fact lose outright to Darth Vader, as I see it, she is to be applauded simply for having got as far as she did. She was acting alone against one of the greatest Jedi hunters of all time, and doing so while being older than dirt. The Revenge of the Sith novelization by Matthew Stover depicted Count Dooku, a truly legendary lightsaber duelist in his own right, as running on fumes during the early to mid stages of his fight against Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker aboard General Grievous's flagship. He was already feeling the adverse effects of his old age when Kenobi was still in the fight. Impressively, and to Dooku's credit, he still managed to neutralize Kenobi before falling before Skywalker. But he was nearly altogether exhausted by Skywalker and only barely able to keep up with him when he was in his early 80s. As presented in the novel, Dooku only lasted as long as he did because the mind games he played with Anakin turned the young prodigy off his game for a brief moment. The mind-boggling absurdity of Anya Kuro's predicament was that she was a minimum of 30 years older than Dooku had been on that day, and unlike the Sith Lord, who was operating almost purely defensively, she was actively taking the fight directly to Darth Vader, disrupting his flow, countering his assaults with offensives of her own. And this wasn't stumbling, bumbling Vader still coming into his own fresh off the operating table. This was Vader around the time frame of A New Hope. I'm not saying Kira was a more skillful duelist than either Anakin or Dooku had been. I'm just putting her feats of endurance, stamina, and her stylish dedication to offense into perspective. What she pulled off, in her condition, was far from easy, even if she made it seem so. Vader himself credited her as a worthy adversary. All of this to say that despite Plo Koon's greater level of fame, I don't actually consider him to be a more skillful or even necessarily more experienced duelist than she is. Her best feats are at worst on par with his own, and she is certainly in his league. But, as we all know, the ideal outcome for an Ataru practitioner is that they will be able to quickly overwhelm their opponent. Setting aside freak accidents and fluke possibilities, this is something Anya Kuro simply wouldn't be able to do to Plo Koon, and sadly, Kira's practice of Ataru would be significantly less sustainable than Koon's Form 5. Unlike Qui-Gon Jinn, Anya Kuro never adapted Ataru to suit the needs of her advancing age. To her credit, she may never have felt the need to, as she clearly aged far more gracefully than Jinn did, but her flagging levels of stamina, evidenced during her final bout with Vader, demonstrate her limitations. To cap all of this off, Plo Koon's style is actually partially designed to address the very problem Anya Kuro is all but guaranteed to run into. He has more leeway here than she does. He certainly couldn't afford to coast here. Even a single mistake would mean death against an opponent as elite as Anya Kuro. But he would be able to remain in his comfort zone longer than she could realistically expect to. He is far more likely to simply outlast her than he is to outfight her. In a technical sense, though, that's still enough to tip the scales in his favor. With that in mind, I award Plo Koon the edge as a martial artist and lightsaber duelist, though only by the slimmest of margins. As a lifetime member of the Jedi High Council, Plo Koon was remarkably strong in the Force. He was especially notable for his facility with a wide array of Force abilities. Some were simply obscure, others could be considered controversial. Nevertheless, he pursued these unorthodox avenues of study with a steady heart and clarity of mind. Listed within his role-playing guide character sheet as a telekinetic savant, such displays of power with these abilities have included powerful force pushes and the ability to bat his targets around without facing them directly. He has used the power for the purposes of reinforcement, often working in concert with his fellow Jedi in order to avert disaster, such as he did during the Stark Hyperspace War. On one occasion, he even succeeded in caving in the entrance to a mountainous cavern in a solo effort while on the run. Plo Koon's mental powers were also highly advanced. These were augmented by his Keldor physiology and have also been facilitated by working in tandem with his fellow Jedi, including his own niece, Sha Koon. Again, during the Stark Hyperspace War, the pair of Keldor Jedi were able to use their telepathy in conjunction with other Jedi Masters to communicate with the High Council from halfway across the galaxy. During the same conflict, he easily managed to probe the mind of the pirate, Iyako Stark, without his presence being perceived, making him aware of everything his enemy was planning, and doing so from a distance. He also used his telepathic abilities to assist Aayla Secura in recovering her lost memories, following an adventure she participated in with her own master, Quinlan Vos. In addition to being a Jedi Master, Plo Koon was also a member of the Barron Do Sages, an obscure order of Force adepts based on his homeworld. Under their guidance, Plo Koon learned the power known as Anya, an ability which could be used to repel mental intrusion. Naturally, Plo Koon was also gifted with the more commonplace applications of telepathy, such as the mind trick for which the Jedi Knights were famed throughout the galaxy. Plo Koon's dedicated study of the physical sciences also seems to have facilitated his Force-given ability to alter the environment around him, better enabling him to perform feats such as the freezing of small bodies of water or influencing a dense fog in order to provide cover. Additionally, Plo Koon also possessed some talent with the power known as Malaysia, of which Oppo Rancisis had been a long-term instructor. This power was used to induce extreme dizziness and nausea within a target, thus incapacitating them without leaving any permanent damage or injury. Victims have likened the short-term effects of the power to the sensation of having been struck on the head by a hammer. While a useful, though strictly non-lethal offensive force power, the technique was reliant on a Jedi's ability to keep their target within their line of sight, and its effect on fellow Force wielders has never been documented in any source. Koon has also demonstrated some skill with the healing arts as well, having used such abilities to treat wounded soldiers serving under his command, or else simply to ease the passing of those who were beyond his ability to save. Plo Koon's most infamous power was Force Lightning, which he learned at the Jedi Temple and later refined, referring to his variation as Electric Judgment. Plo Koon claimed that he had no special interest or fascination with the controversial Force ability, and merely acted in accordance with the will of the Force when he employed the power against the criminal Pommel in order to rescue a 5-year-old hostage. While I'm the first to admit that Electric Judgment is not typically as inherently strong as Sith Lightning, this is chiefly due to the intent behind the user in question. Koon indicated in his report following his mission that he never felt compelled to deal a killing blow using the ability. While this demonstrates the restraint with which the Jedi conducted himself, to me, it also makes clear that the power can be employed with deadly force if he so chooses. Wise and perceptive, subtle and yet powerful, Plo Koon was not afraid to use every weapon in his arsenal, every tool at his disposal, in order to accomplish his goal. Anya Kuro was a mysterious Jedi Master who carried knowledge of several obscure, though highly advanced applications of the Force, and while Jedi such as Even Piel disapproved of her methods, she was recognized by the various Council Masters for the potency of her Force powers. Proficient in the arts of stealth and infiltration, Anya Kurra was able to use her strange powers to great effect while operating in the field. According to her entry in the Clone Wars campaign guide, she was gifted in the use of Force Cloak, a technique whereby a Force user bends light around him or herself, essentially rendering them invisible. More curious than any of her other powers, the Dark Woman also appeared capable of manipulating the fabric of the binding energy field which constituted the Force, allowing her to pass through solid objects. And in a manner similar to that of the Night Sister clan mother Talzin, she also appeared capable of using the Force to teleport. The combination of skill with teleportation and Force stealth gives Kuro some commonality with the Old Republic Sith Lord Darth Jadis, who once used such abilities to evade and outmaneuver his adversaries without even drawing his weapon. The limitations of these powers are not well defined, but the fact that such abilities are so rarely seen among either the Jedi or the Sith speaks to their advanced nature. In my view, the fact that she can use these powers to any degree at all speaks to an unusually strong command of the Force. Although she has never been displayed using them, Anya Kuro has been attributed with the ability to cast Force illusions. While not nearly as destructive nor damaging as the spells conjured by Sith, such as Darth Zana, illusions could be used to distract or mislead targets without physically harming them, a tactic which Jedi Master Yerrel Poof advocated on a philosophical level due to the technique's non-lethal nature. In addition to all this, Kira was also known to experience prophetic dreams and visions which allowed her glimpses into the future. Her entry in the Clone Wars era campaign guide also credits her with skill in technometry, a power similar in nature to Meku Deru. Masters of technometry could sense the inner mechanics of technological devices and droids, and in some cases they could even control them. She also possessed a notable talent with the healing arts. It has been noted by the Sith Lord, Darth Plagueis, that it is normally more difficult to use the Force to heal oneself than it is to do the same for someone else. During the hunt for Aurra Sing, Kira sustained a blaster wound to her shoulder from friendly fire. She healed the injury almost casually, a skill her own one-time student, Ki-Adi-Mundi, displayed as well. Alongside such Jedi as the seemingly interminable Kukruk and the Jedi spy master Thulm, Anya Kuro was also able to enter into a deceptive trance which slowed bodily functions to the point of apparent death. While in this state, her presence in the Force could not be detected, and her life force was preserved despite the severe injuries she had just sustained. Although she has never been observed employing telekinesis in battle, she is credited with skill in a variety of telekinetic applications in her role-playing guide entries, and I do consider the use of such tactics to be well within the scope of her ability. She has successfully defended against the use of telekinesis from Darth Vader, who hurled boulders at her during their battle. Therefore, while it's certainly fair to say that she isn't exactly helpless in this field, unfortunately, we have no way of gauging the magnitude nor frequency with which she herself employs telekinetic abilities. However, on that very occasion, she retaliated against the Sith Lord with yet another unusual force power, known as Plant Surge. More formally referred to as Concerter Sato, this particular power was closely aligned with the light side and endowed force wielders with the ability to compel plant life to promote spontaneous growth or movement. Despite the fact that the ability was rooted in the light side of the Force, it was relatively rare, as it was more commonly mastered by Ithorian nature priests than by actual Jedi. Using this power, Anya Kuro attacked the Sith Lord by manipulating plant life which bound his neck and artificial limbs, leaving him exposed to a potential killing blow, a blow which Vader only narrowly avoided. And finally, Anya Kuro was one of the few Jedi of her time who was able to return as a Force spirit after her physical death, an ability she shared in common with the esteemed Jedi Masters Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda. These two are Jedi Guardians who possessed Force abilities which they developed with the fervency of dedicated Jedi counselors, but their alternative skill sets and unorthodox methods, mindsets, and morals actually gave them greater commonality with Jedi Sentinels. Needless to say, they are both remarkably well-rounded. With respect to knowledge of and skilled application of practical Force abilities, Plo Koon was easily one of the best Jedi Masters of his day. However, during the time in which he lived, I would actually consider Anya Kuro to be one of the few who soundly outclassed him in this particular regard. If I had to pose a theory for Anya Kuro's unique relationship with the Force, I would guess that she was the Jedi Order's answer to the Sith sorceress. Her mental powers and ability to warp space and time around her seemed to me to be less destructive variants of the Force magics, whether found within the ranks of the Sith or other more esoteric groups of mystics. Other forms of magic have been described as manifestations of the Force one is either born with an acute proclivity for or not. Sorcerers are born, not made. If Anya Kuro was in fact using a light side variation of Force magic, this would explain why her abilities were so rarely seen from others. However, this is all the product of speculation and shouldn't be considered much more than food for thought. Given the sheer scope of her abilities relative to Plo Koon's, it would seem, though, that Kira's superiority as a Force wielder would give her a massive advantage over him. However, this is actually an extremely rare circumstance in which neither her greater level of power nor her skill and refinement are enough to conclusively award her the edge. The most important factor to consider when deciding how to award the edge between these two revolves around the question of which of their abilities would actually come into play during a fight on neutral ground. As telepaths, neither have an advantage over the other. The impact of Kira's illusions are not well defined, but even if they were, I don't imagine they would be of much use against Plo Koon, given his own psychic prowess and the defensive mental techniques from his Baron Do training. Force visions, telepathic communication, and technometry have no relevance here. I'm inclined to believe the same where Malaysia is concerned. Anya Kuro is such an elusive target, and so she would be difficult to keep in one's direct line of eyesight long enough to subdue her in this manner. Besides, even if Plo Koon could manage that particular hurdle, I doubt the power would offset a master of the healing arts much in the first place. Anya Kuro's abilities to manipulate plant life, impressive as they are, would be of no benefit in a contest on truly neutral ground, and in the absence of natural obstructions like trees, hiding places such as waterfalls or caves, or even artificial barriers such as walls, her abilities with stealth and her incredible power to phase through solid matter wouldn't really come into play. While it would actually be possible for her to implement her teleportation abilities, such powers would amount to a wasted effort in such close quarters, as she'd ultimately have nowhere to run. As such, I don't really think she would bother wasting the energy reserves necessary to use the power, unless she decided to abandon the fight altogether and retreat, thereby conceding the contest. It's time to make a fine point of distinction here, which could actually make the final verdict potentially confusing, so please, bear with me while I explain. Anya Kuro's skills allow her to make far better use of virtually any possible surrounding environment than Plo Koon ever could. Imagine what she could do to him if the two were fighting in a labyrinth, for example, where walls would mean nothing to her. What would happen if she could ambush Koon after teleporting behind a waterfall, or bind him with dozens of roots and vines, tearing off his breath mask in the process? In situations like those, the odds would most certainly favor Anya Kuro any day, quite decisively. Make no mistake, Anya Kuro is the more masterful Force wielder, but under these circumstances, she is actually quite limited. Plo Koon's more frequent uses of telekinesis and his ability to generate Force lightning while nowhere near overwhelming enough to conclusively defeat a master of Anya Kuro's caliber, afford him a broader and more direct combative skill set. This better enables him to keep the pressure up. In a reversal of the dynamic between them as martial artists, he is actually the more committed offensive force wielder. However, I wish to again stress that this is only true in the context of a fight on neutral ground. Given the right circumstances, Anya Kuro is easily the most adept at transforming the dueling ground itself into a weapon. If these two were to come across one another out in the wild, we'd be in for a spectacle. The clash would trigger subtle distortions of reality, as Koon attempts to press his offensive advantage, while Kuro more or less becomes one with the world around her, retreating into warped pockets of space and reappearing to exploit holes in her opponent's line of defense, arming herself with all that surrounds her. He lives in a harmonious balance with nature, attuned to the nuances of the Force, a reverent servant of the light. All the same, he is in command of a great sundering power, and he is willing to call it forth. She is a beautiful oddity, seemingly partially already one with the Force, fading in and out of the physical realm, living at once apart from and yet profoundly within her surroundings, capable of standing her ground without ever truly feeling it beneath her feet. I find myself drawing parallels between the skill sets of these two Jedi and the capabilities of benders from the Avatar universe. Specifically, I would single out the dynamic between the power of fire and the power of air. Benders of every nation and martial arts discipline can do extraordinary things. However, most are heavily reliant on the ability to draw on an external source of their associated element in order to put their powers to any use. Firebenders alone are capable of generating their associated element. Fire is the element of power. As a force wielder, this is what I feel Plo Koon represents in the context of this matchup. Presently manifested power, power which can be called upon in the here and now, summoned from within, and directed by the Jedi toward a target of his choosing. However, while this makes him less encumbered than his opponent, this isn't to say that Anya Kuro is completely out of her depth here. After all, a firebender, like the flame he or she produces, must always be able to breathe. And, seen in this light, where there's fire, there must also be air. The element of freedom, air was the most dynamic of the bending disciplines, and while not technically generated by the airbenders themselves, engineering a circumstance where one could feasibly be cut off from their element would be next to impossible. And so, for all intents and purposes, while firebenders are indeed unique in that they alone create their element and summon it from within, they would never be able to exercise this advantage against an airbender, as the source of their power is always close at hand. And in every scenario except for the one that I've laid out for the purposes of this video, this sums up my view of Plo Koon versus Anya Kuro quite nicely. If allowed, she would undoubtedly use her powers to influence or exploit the surrounding environment to great effect. She nearly brought down Darth Vader. She most likely would therefore actually succeed against Plo Koon if operating under similar conditions. Her powers grant her greater versatility, creativity, mobility, and freedom. She is the more dynamic, and dare I say more powerful of the two, capable of seemingly impossible feats, even by Jedi standards. But in an empty sparring chamber, this doesn't actually provide her with as many advantages as one might think. With the majority of her greatest powers not being readily applicable, the fight has been reduced to a duel of attrition. Now, based on her performance against Darth Vader, I actually do think she's skilled enough to stand a chance of outfencing Plo Koon before she reaches the point of exhaustion. However, I consider this to be a mere possibility, not the probability. She is skilled enough to push him outside of his comfort zone, but not so skilled that she's guaranteed to do so beyond the boundaries of his limitations. The effort of defending against and attempting to counter the combination of his offensive force abilities and formidable dueling technique would eventually prove too taxing for her, and she would, in all likelihood, be forced to admit defeat. For these reasons, I feel I must award Plo Koon the circumstantial edge as a force wielder, and in doing so, I must also name him the ultimate victor of this contest. For the record, I just want to say that this has nothing to do with bias. Between the two, Anya Kuro is my preferred character, as I find her so fascinating. The only reason I'm bringing this up where I normally don't is because I have noticed a certain degree of backlash against my fellow Versus series creators by viewers who think we always overrate the abilities of particular characters, Plo Koon being among them. If it ever seems like I'm overrating Koon's abilities in this video, or underrating those of anyone else, please trust that this is not my intent. Now, having said that, this is probably the last time that I will feature the character in my Versus series, as there are a number of other characters I have not yet used before that I'm excited to get to, and I do think that Plo Koon has become a bit overused at this point. The creative spark that drove me to commit to this matchup regardless of that fact though, was my desire to readdress Kuro's force abilities, which I think I slightly overestimated the last time I used her, and paired with Plo Koon, an interesting truth came to light. As I researched, I realized here was a chance to really get back to the basics of what I feel a Versus video is meant to express. Out of all the richly textured alien environments scattered throughout the galaxy in which this fight could potentially take place, and despite the many legendary and exotic force abilities possessed by both Jedi, only one outcome is most heavily favored once we bring our thoughts back down to Earth. For a contest brimming with boundless possibility, a fight between these two on neutral ground narrows the odds ever so slightly in favor of Plo Koon. But remember this, it is only what I consider to be the most likely outcome. Plo Koon is by no means guaranteed a victory over the Dark Woman, no matter what the circumstance. As always, this is all just my opinion, based on my interpretation of the evidence, and all done in the name of good fun. Thanks for meditating on this with me today, and may the Force be with you, always.